Hey there, Scouts and Scouters. Sven Gilkey here, District Director for the North Cascades District, and welcome to today's St. George event. So, first of all, who is the St. George guy, and why are we having a St. George event? Well, the answer to that can be found right here in my reprinting of the 1907 Scouting for Boys, the original handbook for scouting, written by Lord Robert Baden-Powell. So, in a section on chivalry and the Knight's Code, Baden-Powell had a little excerpt entitled St. George. They had as their patron saint St. George because he was the only one of their saints who was on horse. He is the patron saint of cavalry and scouts all over Europe. St. George is the special saint of England. The battle cry of the knights used to be, "For St. George and Merry England." St. George's Day is the 23rd of April, and on that day, all good scouts wear a rose in his honor and fly their flags. Don't forget it on the next 23rd of April. Now, while St. George is obviously the patron saint of England and of chivalry, he's also the patron saint of scouting. And Baden-Powell reaffirmed this in 1914 and then years later with the World Scouting Movement, because for him, scouting and the code of chivalry were one and the same. He believed that scouts today are the modern knights who roam the world looking for dragons to battle and face and change the world for the better. In fact, in one of his letters in the 1930s, he actually outlined how he felt the similarities between our scouting program and the Knights worked, with Cub Scouts acting kind of like the pages of old. They were the young kids who were brought on to learn the ways of knighthood, and yeah, they didn't really go on a lot of the adventures. They had to maintain some of the armor and help the knight get ready and things like that, but they didn't go into battle. They didn't face the dragons with the knight. But squires, that's where he viewed the Boy Scouts. Now, the pages were Cub Scouts, the Boy Scouts were the squires, and they were the ones who were really learning what it meant to be a knight. And so they would actually gear up and go out to face the dragon with the knight. And that's how our scouts now and scout troops work, is they might not necessarily be facing dragons, but they do gear up for the big tasks. They are leaders. They do put on that armor and face the world as scouts. And then his last view, in the United States, we have the venturing program, but Baden-Powell founded a program called Rovers. And the Rover Scouts, the idea was that this was a young adult, even up into the 20s, adult program where the idea was that a scout would just rove about looking for challenges in the world to face, and they would help other people at all times. The motto of the Rover Scouts is service, just as the motto for the Boy Scouts program is be prepared. And if you think about it, those are perfect analogies to a squire and a knight. A squire should always be prepared, and a knight should always remember to be of service. So for the St. George's Day event today, we've got a couple of things. First of all, I want to give a huge shout out to a YouTuber that I've been paying a lot of attention to. He's from the United Kingdom. While my family's in quarantine here, I've been watching his stuff pretty regularly. He puts out some great stuff on scouting. His channel's called Scoutadelic. And as a matter of fact, I'd like to introduce him here in just a moment to explain a little bit about St. George's Day. Being English, he has a much closer connection than we as Americans do to St. George and the celebration of the day. So I'm going to have him talk about that. I'm also going to do a reading of St. George and the Dragon. This was one of my childhood books, actually, that I really loved as a kid, and I want to share it with you. And it's going to explain a little bit my special neckerchief, which is the Cross of St. George. And you'll see that in the story here in a little bit. And then after that, I've got a clip from Scoutadelic's St. George Day event, where a scout from Northern Ireland is going to explain a little bit of the history of connecting St. George's Day and scouting, and some of the traditions that are conducted in the United Kingdom and around the world for that, and how it all started in the early 20th century. And then last but not least, we'll be coming back and saying the Scout Oath and renewing our promise as scouts to always do our duty. So I'll be seeing you in just a moment. Thanks, guys.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to Togetherness, our St. George's Day event. and today is hopefully a good one for us all. I am Mike, and I am from a YouTube channel called Scoutadelic. I've been doing that for almost 5 years now. St George's Day is always on the 23rd of April, and what usually happens is groups, districts, counties in the UK and some around the world, what they do is they celebrate on the weekend closest to that, which is today. And what they normally do is they do a lot of either activities, parades, all discussing one thing, which is St George. Now, St George, if you aren't aware, is the patron saint of Scouting. And Baden-Powell obviously decided on that early on in Scouting for Boys in one of the books. Now, St George's Day, I always feel, should be inclusive to everyone. Wherever you are in the world, whatever language, whatever religion you are, it should be inclusive for you. And that is hopefully what we've done with this event today for you. It is a worldwide celebration of Scouting and being together, especially in this time when I am here in my house all alone talking to a camera. But I'm talking to you because I know you're here celebrating Scouting with me, and I am with you the same. I'm glad you can attend, whether you're watching this live right now on YouTube, whether you're listening to this live on Scout Radio, or alternatively, if you're re-watching this at a later time or day, whatever, I am still here celebrating it with you. And that is what it's all about. It's about celebrating because Scouting is a big part of our lives. We are a big family, and this situation that has happened, this pandemic in the world, has made us all realise that we are not alone. We are not a group or a unit or a section or whatever. We are a bigger picture in this global world, and you are not the only Scout in it. And we need to show that and follow that and celebrate that.
Today I will be reading St. George and the Dragon, retold by Margaret Hodges and illustrated by Trina Hyman. In the days when monsters and giants and fairy folk lived in England, a noble knight was riding across a plain. He wore heavy armor and carried an ancient silver shield marked with a red cross. It was dented with the blows of many battles fought long ago by other brave knights. The Red Cross Knight had never yet faced a foe and did not even know his name or where he had been born. But now he was bound on a great adventure, sent by the Queen of the Fairies to try his young strength against a deadly enemy, a dragon grim and horrible. Beside him, on a little white donkey, rode a princess, leading a white lamb, and behind him came a dwarf carrying a small bundle of food. The lady's lovely face was veiled, and her shoulders were covered with a black cloak, as if she had a hidden sorrow in her heart. Her name was Una. The dreadful dragon was the cause of her sorrow. He was laying waste to her land, so that many frightened people had left their homes and run away. Others had shut themselves inside the walls of a castle with Una's father and mother, the king and queen of the country. But Una had set out alone from the safety of the castle walls to look for a champion who would face the terrible dragon. She had traveled a long, long way before she found the Red Cross Knight. Like a sailor long at sea, under stormy winds and fierce sun, who begins to whistle merrily when he sees land, so Una was thankful. Now the travelers rode together through wild woods and wilderness, perils and dangers, toward Una's kingdom. The path they had to follow was straight and narrow, but not easy to see. Sometimes the Red Cross Knight rode too far ahead of Una and lost his way. Then she had to find him and guide him back to the path. So they journeyed on, with Una by his side, fair and faithful. No monster or giant could stand before the knight's bright sword.
After many days, the path became thorny and led up a steep hillside, where a good old hermit lived in a little house by himself. While Una rested, the Red Cross Knight climbed with the hermit to the top of the hill and looked out across the valley. There, against the evening sky, they saw a mountain top that touched the highest heavens. It was crowned with a glorious palace, sparkling like stars and circled with walls and towers of pearl and precious stones. Joyful angels were coming and going between heaven and the high city. When the Red Cross Knight saw that a little path led up the distant mountain to the city, he said, "I thought the fairest palace in the world was the Crystal Tower in the city of the Fairy Queen. Now I see a palace far more lovely. Una and I should go there at once." But the hermit said, "The Fairy Queen has sent you to do brave deeds in this world. That high city that you see is in another world. Before you climb the path to it and hang your shield on its wall, go down into the valley and fight the dragon that you were sent to fight." It is time for me to tell you that you were not born of fairy folk, but of English earth. The fairies stole you away as a baby while you slept in your cradle. They hid you in a farmer's field where a plowman found you. He called you George, which means plow the earth and fight the good fight. For you were born to be England's friend and patron saint, St. George of merry England. Then George, the Red Cross Knight, returned to Una, and when morning came, they went together down into the valley. They rode through the farmlands, where men and women working in their fields looked up and cheered because a champion had come to fight the dragon, and children clapped their hands to see the brave knight and the lovely lady ride by. "Now we have come to my own country," said Una. "Be on your guard. See, there is the city and the great brass tower that my parents built strong enough to stand against the brazen-scaled dragon. There are my father and mother looking out from the walls, and the watchman standing on the top, waiting to call out the good news if help is coming." Then they heard a hideous roaring that filled the air with terror and seemed to shake the ground. The dreadful dragon lay stretched on the sunny side of the green hill, like a great hill himself. When he saw the knight's armor glistening in the sunlight, he came eagerly to do battle. The knight bade his ladies stand apart, out of danger, to watch the fight, while the beast drew near, half flying, half running. His great size made a wide shadow under his huge body, as a mountain cast a shadow on a valley. He reared high, monstrous, horrible, and vast, armed all over with scales of brass, fitted so closely that no sword or spear could pierce them. They clashed with every movement. The dragon's wings stretched out like two sails when the wind filled them. The clowns fled before him. His huge long tail, speckled red and black, wound in a huge folds over his scaly back and swept the land before him for almost half a mile. In its tail's end 2 sharp stings were fixed, but sharper still were his cruel claws. Whatever he touched or drew with his claws was in deadly danger. His head was more hideous than tongue can tell, for his deep jaws gaped wide, showing 3 rows of iron teeth ready to devour his prey. A cloud of smothering smoke and burning sulfur poured from his throat, filling the air with his stench. His blazing eyes, flaming with rage, glared out from the deep in his head. So he came toward the knight, raising his speckled breast, clashing his scales as he leaped to greet his newest victim. The knight on horseback fiercely rode at the dragon with all his might, and couched his spear, but as they passed, the pointed steel glazed off the dragon's hard hide. The wrathful beast, surprised at the strength of the blow, quickly turned, and passing the knight again, brushed him with his long tail, so that horse and men fell to the ground. Once more the Red Cross Knight mounted and attacked the dragon. Once more in vain. Yet the beast had never before felt such a mighty stroke from the hand of any man, and he was furious for revenge. With his waving wings spread wide, he lifted himself high from the ground. Then, stooping low, snatched up both horse and man to carry them away. High above the plain, he bore them as far as a bow can shoot an arrow. But even then, the knight still struggled against the monster, was forced to lower his paws so that both horse and rider fought free. With the strength of 3 men against the knight struck, the spear glanced off the scaly neck, but it pierced the dragon's left wing, spread bore above him, and the beast roared like a raging sea in a winter storm. Furious, he snatched the spear in his claws and broke it off, throwing forth flames of fire from his nostrils. Then he hurled his hideous tail about and wrapped it around the legs of the horse, until, striving to loose the knot, the horse threw its rider to the ground. Quickly the knight rose. He drew his sharp sword and struck the dragon's head so fiercely that it seemed nothing could withstand the blow. The dragon's crest was so hard to take a cut, but he wanted no more such blows. He tried to fly away and could not because of his wounded wing. Loudly he bellowed, and like was never heard before. And from his body, like a wide, devouring oven, sent a flame of fire that scorched the knight's face and heated his armor red hot. Faint, weary, and sore, burning with heat and wounds, the knight fell to the ground, ready to die. And the dragon clapped his iron wings in victory, while the lady, watching from afar, fell to her knees. She thought that her champion had lost the battle. But it happened that where the knight fell, an ancient spring of silvery water bubbled from the ground. In that cool water the knight lay resting until the sun rose. Then he too rose to do battle again, and when the dragon saw him, he could hardly believe his eyes. Could this be the same knight, he wondered, or another who had come to take his place? The knight brandished the bright blade, and it seemed sharper than ever, his hands even stronger. He smote the crested head with a blow so mighty that the dragon reared up like 100 raging lions. His long, stinging tail threw down high trees and tore rocks to pieces. Lashing forward, it pierced the knight's shield, and point struck fast in his shoulder. He tried to free himself from that barbed sting, but when he saw that his struggles were in vain, he raised his fighting sword and struck a blow that cut off the end of the dragon's tail. Heart cannot think what outrage and what cries, with black smoke and flashing fire, the beast threw forth, turning the whole world to darkness. Gathering himself up, wild for revenge, he fiercely fell upon the sun-bright shield and gripped it fast with his paws. 3 times the knight tried and failed to pull the shield free. Then, laying about him with his trusty sword, he struck so many blows that the fire flew from the dragon's coat like sparks from an anvil. And the beast raised one paw to defend himself. Striking with might and main, the knight severed the other paw, which still clung to the shield. Now, from the furnace inside himself, the dragon threw huge flames that covered all the heavens with smoke and brimstone, so that the knight was forced to retreat to save his body from the scorching fire. Again, weary and wounded with his long fight, he fell. When gentle Una saw him lying motionless, she trembled with fear and prayed for his safety. But he had fallen beneath a fair apple tree. Its spreading branches covered with red fruit, and from that tree dropped a healing dew that the deadly dragon did not dare to come near. Once more the daylight faded, and night spread over the earth. Under the apple tree, the knight slept. Then dawn chased away the dark, A lark mounted up to heaven, and up rose the brave knight with all his hurts and wounds healed, ready to fight again. When the dragon saw him, he began to be afraid. Still he rushed upon the knight, mouth gaping wide to swallow him whole, and the knight's bright weapon, taking advantage of that open jaw, ran it through with such strength that the dragon fell dead, breathing his last in smoke and cloud. Like a mountain he fell, and lay still. The knight himself trembled to see that fall, and his dear lady did not dare to come near to thank her faithful knight until she saw that the dragon would stir no more. Now our ship comes into port. Furl the sails and drop anchor, safe from storm. Una is at her journey's end. The watchman on the castle wall called out to the king and queen that the dragon was dead, and when the old king saw that it was true, he ordered the castle's great brass gate to be opened, so that the tidings of peace and joy might spread through all the land. Trumpets sounded the news that the great beast had fallen. Then the king and queen came out of the city with all their nobles to meet the Red Cross Knight. Tall young men led the way, carrying laurel branches to lay at the hero's feet. Pretty girls wore wreaths of flowers and made music on tambourines. The children came dancing, laughing and singing, with a crown of flowers for Una. They gazed in wonder at the victorious knight. But when the people saw where the dragon lay, they dared not come near to touch him. Some ran away, some pretended not to be afraid. One said the dragon might still be alive. One said that he saw fire in the eyes. Another said that the eyes were moving. When a foolish child ran forward to touch the dragon's claws, his mother scolded him. "How can I tell?" she said. "Those claws might scratch my son, or tear his tender hand." At last, some of the bolder men began to measure the dragon to prove how many acres his body covered. The old king embraced and kissed his daughter. He gave gifts of gold and ivory and 1,000 thanks to the dragon slayer. But the knight told the king never to forget the poor people and gave the rich gifts to them. Then, back to the palace all the people went, still singing, to feast and to hear the story of the knight's adventures with Una. When the tale ended, the king said, "Never did living man sail through such a sea of deadly dangers. Since you are now safely come to shore, stay here and live happily ever after. You have earned your rest." But the brave knight answered, "No, my lord, I have sworn to give a knight's service to the fairy queen for 6 years. Until then, I cannot rest." The king said, "I have promised the dragon slayer should have Una for his wife, and be king after me. If you love each other, my daughter is yours now. My kingdom shall be yours when you have done your service for the fairy queen and returned to us." Then he called Una, who came no longer wearing her black cloak and veil, but dressed in a lily-white gown that shimmered like silver. Never had the knight seen her so beautiful. Whenever he looked at the brightness of her sunshiny face, his heart melted. So Una and the Red Cross Knight were married and lived together joyfully. But the knight did not forget his promise to serve the fairy queen, and when she called him into service, off he rode on brave adventures, until at last he earned his name, St. George of Merry England.
Hello, my name is Rhiannon and I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm going to share with you all a little bit about the history of Scouting and St. George's Day. And this information was kindly provided by Caroline from the Scout Heritage Centre, so a big thank you to her from all of us. Every April, Scouts across the world come together to celebrate St. George's Day. This year it looks a little bit differently, but let's take a look back at the origins of how this celebration began. When writing his book, Scouting for Boys, Robert Baden-Powell assigned St. George as patron of the Scouts. He felt that this legendary story of bravery could inspire Scouts no matter what their colour or creed. In 1914, he decided that St. George's Day should be a special Scout Day where leaders and scouts could reflect on their scouting and renew their promises. By encouraging this, he hoped to connect scouts from across the world. Often, this is celebrated on the closest weekend to the 23rd of April. How Scouts has celebrated St. George's Day has evolved. Back in 1914, Colchester Scouts made their celebrations inclusive by holding a service in their HQ clubroom, so Scouts from all denominations could attend, and this was followed by a special afternoon tea. That month, Scout HQ was flooded with reports of troops holding parties and parades, visiting other Scouts, and starting pen pal friendships with Scouts from across the world. In 1934, the first National Scout Service was held at Windsor Castle for 750 King Scouts from 39 countries. At this event, they were greeted by King George V and Queen Mary. Then, in 1937, Scouts who had received gallantry awards were also invited to attend the Windsor event. And Robert Baden-Powell also attended for the first and only time. Due to the Second World War, there were then no services held from 1940 to 1945. But they've continued in all forms ever since. This celebration today is different from Baden-Powell's original idea, but the ethos of connectivity and reflection is ever more important today than it ever has been. And we thank you all so much for being part of today's event. Thank you.
Okay, Scouts. Well, I hope that you've enjoyed learning a little bit about St. George's Day, and while this year, because of COVID-19, I've been scrambling for really any excuse to do scouting. Being cooped up here at home, I haven't gone to visit my troops or my packs, obviously, in over a month, and St. George's Day and other activities like this have really given me the opportunity to reach out and spend time scouting again, and I hope that you're taking advantage of such opportunities as well. But with that said, I'm really hoping that maybe St. George's Day will become more of a foundation point in our program going forward, and something to remember year after year, because I know I say the Scout Oath on a regular basis, but I don't necessarily stop and think about it anymore. Unless I'm teaching a group of Tenderfoot Scouts the purpose and meaning of the Scout Oath, I don't really stop and take it apart and really think about what I'm saying. I'm just going along with the rest of the Scouts in a troop or pack meeting. So right now, I want you to take a moment and join me in saying the Scout Oath and really think about it. Think about what you're saying, that you are going to do on your honor, your duty to God and country, to help other people, and to take care of yourself. So please, rise, make the Scout sign, and join me in the Scout Oath. On my honor, I will do my best to do my duty to God and my country, and to obey the Scout law, to help other people at all times, and to keep myself physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. Thank you for joining us today on the St. George Day event. I hope that you guys are having a great time with the National Camp-In. I hope that you were able to catch the campfire program last night that the Mount Baker Council put on. If you missed it, you can catch it at mountbakerbsa.org/scouton, and then click on the live events page. It's listed as one of the past live events, and you can watch it there. This video will also be uploaded there here later today, so if you are looking to re-experience the St. George Day event or want to share it with another Scout somewhere in the world, you can do that as well. And remember, always take the opportunity to ask your friends to join Scouting. We need all the knights to face all the dragons, because while they might not be scaly and green and breathing fire anymore, there are challenges in the world, and we need all the Scouts we can get to help face those challenges. Thank you, Scouts, and don't forget, be prepared.